Today we're going to be talking about two different games, the Heilwald Loophole, which I'm just going to call Loophole because I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and Liquidators. This was just going to be a Liquidators review, but that game's only 30 minutes to an hour long, depending on how overburdened with intelligence you are. I decided to add Loophole to the review because I think the two games complement each other very well, and they have a lot of similarities. Loophole is a first-person puzzle horror game with a pretty simple premise. Escape the Heilwald Clinicum. The gameplay is about what you'd expect. You go around looking for items, and if a monster shows up, you basically only have two options, run or hide. Except there's a twist. You can't actually die. As a matter of fact, nobody can die here. We'll get into more what that means for gameplay and story later. The game was mostly made by a single dude from Germany named Jan Malischek. I hope I said that right. Obviously, it has the look and sound of a PS1 game, but it's also got some really good writing and some genuinely funny moments. And some toilet humor. Like a lot of toilet humor. Of course, just because death is entirely non-existent here, doesn't mean the game won't try to scare you at least a few times. Half of the battle for scares is fought by visuals, so we'll start with those. The game is very faithful to the PSX style of graphical fidelity. I'm not going to spend too long talking about the more technical side of the graphics, since I'm sure everyone's familiar with the PS1 style homage by now. It's competent, it's well done, it's got the texture wiggling, reminds me a lot of A-Trot. What's more interesting to me is the game's art style. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of brown here. The game uses a very earthy color palette, which means a lot of brown, more brown, and sometimes some shades of green. I think the colors work for the game, and most of the areas are visually distinct enough so the colors don't really matter anyway, but it might start to blend together for some people. For me, they add a sense of dreariness and decay to the location, which given its inhabitants, makes sense. It also makes the moments with brighter colors stand out even more. But for the most part, even the most well-maintained areas are going to look gloomy. Not that you'll find very many well-maintained areas around here, of course. Everything about the visual style can be summarized with the word decay. Everything is falling apart, from the people to the property. Of course, not everyone here is decaying, at least not like these poor guys. Most of the main characters you meet are at least mostly intact, although some are more, altered than others. It's not easy to judge a book by its cover here either, since... my god. Could it really be? It's not easy to judge a book by its cover here either, since some of the more evil characters look relatively normal. Unlike the friendly trash collector, who looks like he should probably lay off the dwarven diet. I really like the character designs in this game, and they contrast well with some later versions of themselves. Character interactions and enemy encounters are a large part of Loophole, so I think it's important that the designs are interesting, or at least fitting. I certainly won't forget some of these designs. Some of the enemy audio design is also fantastic. Sound effects themselves are good, and they're at least distinct, but for me the voice acting is what elevates them. I don't want to spoil it just yet, but the first enemy encounter has a really great moment that got me the first time. There's also a part about halfway through the game that has more voice acting than I would have expected from a game like this, but it's done really well. Of course, since we're looking at horror games, we have to talk about the music. I think horror game music is a bit underrated, and even the more forgettable stuff can really heighten the mood if done right. Since this game is also about 1/3 black comedy, some spooky music is also used for a couple of well-done bits. For the most part, the music is this dread-filled slow burn, but there's a couple of parts, especially the middle section I mentioned, that add a sense of mysticism to it. It's not afraid to ramp up in tension either, especially if you're being chased. The music got my heart rate up whenever I heard it, so I guess that means it's doing its job. The gameplay itself, like I said earlier, is pretty simple. You progress through areas by poking around and using items, and sometimes you have to run away or hide from the bad guys. The main mechanic of the game is the titular loophole, which when encountered allows you to go back to any previously visited areas to retry them. It's not exactly time travel, since some elements are retained even when you go back, but it more or less resets an area. This allows you to experiment with an area to find secrets or even entirely new routes. It basically plays out like a Give Yourself Goosebumps book, except you have to figure out which pages get you to the end. It's a cool spin on the usual time travel tomfoolery, but it does erode some of the tension provided by the unknownness of enemies. This isn't entirely true for some enemies, but we'll get to that. The actual gameplay itself might not be interesting if you bounce off of games like Amnesia, but at least you can see correctly here. I found it at least engaging enough to get through the 3 or so hours it takes to complete, and there's enough secrets and variety in the areas to stave off repetition. There's not much else to say about gameplay. It really is as simple as just solving puzzles and hiding from scary people. The context of the scary people is up next, and unless you want me to just spoil everything right in front of you, jump to this timestamp. Alright, let's start from the beginning. The game starts with the head doctor of the clinic, Dr. Randolph, finishing his speech. He declares that no one will die in his clinic, and we're about to find out just how dedicated the hospital is to that promise. You wake up after falling through a hole, and after a bit of walking through storage, you stumble into the good doctor himself. He very kindly escorts you to his office, and explains that he wants to try a procedure on you. Everybody gangster until the guy speaking in gibberish starts to speak in English.
Where are you going?
After getting sedated, you can break out of this prison area and begin your first loop. From here, you can either get caught again, or if you're good enough, you can find a syringe to knock out the doctor and take his keycard. Don't worry, he'll be back. From here, we enter the sick ward. There's a bunch of decrepit patients around, and a few things we can do. Taking one route will send you to the electrotherapist office, where she offers to give you a free medical procedure. You can either accept her offer, kinda accept her offer, or rudely break into her medical lab. You will need her card to progress further on, though. You can also take a visit to the cafeteria and eat the slop from the angriest chef alive. Unfortunately for you, the soup will always prevail. After those visits, you can make your way to the courtyard and make a friend, the all-knowing garbage man who makes some of the grossest sounds I've ever heard. You will provide knowledge when provided that yummy microplastic, but not much else for now. From the courtyard, you can either have an incident in the library or go to the bathhouse. The library has some of the cooler encounters, first with the gentle giant downstairs or with the jealous bookkeeper. If you take anything from him, he will bend reality to escort you off the premises. You'll need to come here later, but for now we stop by the bathhouse. This area can go a few ways depending on what exactly you do, and it also has some of the best enemy designs in my opinion. It's all about this buff guy Wolfram, and depending on what you do, he can either turn into a big showerhead guy, a normal guy, or a big brush guy. However you deal with him, you'll end up back in the courtyard at some point. From here, we go back into the library, and assuming that we helped the big birthday boy, we can finally escape into a worse area. But before we can go much further, we need to visit the area outside of time. Okay, so throughout the game there are these pipes that have a cork on them, plus some tape. All of the pipes we've seen so far have been sealed, but here, we finally encounter a pipe we can uncork, and once we do, a voice speaks to us.
It's been a while. A long while. A long while of only being able to watch as it went up in flames. They did not seek my counsel any longer. Quite the opposite. They tried to silence me, and I fear they succeeded.
He brings more questions than answers, but I love the level of mystery he adds to the game. He also brings a surprisingly complex puzzle with him. In one room, there are 4 statues that repeat abridged parts of the Hippocratic Oath. In the other room, there are 6 statues of the main people you've encountered by this point. The puzzle is to figure out which part of the oath these people have broken. I had to break out my notebook for this, if only to avoid running in between the 2 rooms. After you solve the puzzle and make your way out, you encounter your final ally, Nurse Helene. Man, that's some unfortunate timing. She'll help you if you can get her patient's medicine, and after a close encounter with a deformed ex-nurse and everyone's favorite jaundice victim, you can finally go face the doctor. He's in his new dental clinic, still under construction, please mind the mess. After you go through a kind of horrifying procedure, you encounter his final form. There's not really much to do here other than run in circles. After the voice from earlier laments about the corruption of the clinic, he opens a loophole and you have to trick Randolph into falling through. And, for the first time ever, someone dies at the clinic. There's still a few questions that aren't answered at this point, like what that statue area is, or how everyone was unable to die, or what the voice was. The game keeps it all symbolic and vague, but I think this is a great ending. And now, we move into a realm stranger than fiction, history. Liquidators is a first-person puzzle horror game, except instead of facing any particular monster, you are facing something much worse: radiation. It was also mostly made by one guy, and the premise is pretty simple. You play as the 3 Liquidators who are responsible for draining the tanks underneath the rapidly melting core. If you've seen the TV show Chernobyl, you know that you really don't want to mess this task up. Unlike Loophole, death is very much a looming threat, and the environments themselves can kill you. This game has a different kind of dread about it, and this dread is largely conveyed by its presentation. Liquidators, despite being a sixth the length of Loophole, is several gigabytes bigger. Thanks, Unreal. The game definitely has the Unreal post-processing tinge to it, but the technical nature of the graphics are once again not the important part. The only effect that I really cared about was the screen pixelation, and I think it looks alright on the default strong setting, but it can be adjusted if it's too much. For me, what's important is conveying how dangerous the environment is. Light, and the lack of it, is a big factor here, and there are instances where you have to navigate almost entirely in the dark. There's also the black sludge everywhere that'll hurt you if you get too close to it. Some spots are so dangerous that simply looking at them will kill you in seconds, such as the elephant's foot. There's some cosmic horror in a pile of sand you have to avoid being seen by. Anyway, the rest of the visual style is fine. The architecture looks believable, although it obviously takes some liberties with accuracy. I think the changes were for the better, and they serve the gameplay well. Although, if you know anything about the real operation, you would know graphics wouldn't have mattered much if the game was completely accurate. The most you'll usually see of the characters are their hands, and on occasion maybe a ragdoll body. These are both okay. Sonically, there's a lot of subtleties that add to the game's atmosphere. The music is very subtle, mostly just droning ambience, but it adds a quiet tension to your actions. It also adds some hostility to the environment, which is, again, killing you by simply being there. It's really simple, but I think it works well because of the sound effects. The sounds of your Geiger counter combined with the slow pulsing of the music, and with these elements, the room tells me that I shouldn't be there. Some rooms are more persuasive than others. In some areas, I couldn't really tell the music apart from the sound effects, like in this generator room. That could be musical in nature, or it could just be the generator running. Either way, it adds a ton to how the game presents itself. The sounds themselves aren't anything crazy, they're mostly what you'd expect from a game about being in Chernobyl. They serve their purpose, which works for me. There is also a minor bit of voice acting, and it's fine. There's like 5 or 6 lines of dialogue at most, but they're competently done, so whatever. My only complaint about audio is that the opening video is a bit too loud by default, but this is just a nitpick. There's not much to say about the gameplay. It's fairly simple. You're tasked with finding several valves and activating them. Activate the 4 upper valves, and the water will lower far enough to let you access the last 2. Getting to the valves is easier said than done, and each one is behind some kind of obstacle. Most of the game is figuring out how to solve these puzzles, and failure means succumbing to radiation or drowning. It's pretty much inevitable that you'll be irradiated at least a little bit, and this will affect how much health you have. Each Liquidator has a set maximum health, but by standing in a radioactive area for too long, the maximum will eventually go down. You can find health packs around which will get rid of any radiation damage, but your health bar will stay at its new maximum for the duration. If you take enough damage to fill the bar, you'll go down and one of the other Liquidators will have to come in and finish the mission. If you lose all 3, it's game over, which like I said is really not ideal. If you can get to a downed Liquidator, you can drag him back to the terminal at the starting area, and from there you can revive him. He'll be available the next time you have to switch out, but his max health will be where it was when he went down. There's also a likely chance that your flashlight will explode, which is realistic, but not good if you want to see. You can find spare flashlights around the facility, which are somehow still operational. The Liquidators themselves have some minor differences which help them out in different areas. Valery is capable of crawling, which lets him get around some obstacles almost entirely. Boris took extra iodine pills and can tank more radiation damage. And Alexei knows how to activate buttons, which lets him turn on some lights. And that's pretty much it. You'll be spending your time trying to figure out how not to get cooked trying to save the entirety of Europe. It's a tense experience for sure, but if you lose all of your guys it can get a bit tedious redoing everything. It's a great game to play through once. Given the price of none dollars, I'd highly recommend this game if you only have like an hour to live or something and you need to play a horror game. It's a good, well, it's an interesting time playing it, and paired with Loophole, makes for a great afternoon of spooky games. Loophole is at most $10, and I think that price is well worth it. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the delay, I know Halloween was actually more like a couple weeks ago. Procrastination has a stranglehold on my brain. Up next is The Void, which might actually kill me in real life. I'll try to have it out in a timely manner. One last thing, I want to thank everyone who helped me get to 100 subscribers. It's a small number, but if I had to speak in front of that many people at once in real life, I would die on stage. The road to 1,000 is a long one, but I'm confident we'll get there. Until next time.